Hi everyone, welcome to this edition of Talk of the Town. I am James Milan, talking to one of my favorite guests, our State Senator Cindy Friedman, with whom we always have important, content-rich, and fun conversations. So Cindy, thanks for joining us again.
Hi James, and thank you for having me.
We appreciate it, really, we do. I want to start off talking about money issues for a bit, and then we'll get on to other stuff as well. But the State Senate just released their budget for the upcoming year, and I know that education, drug pricing, obstacles to growth, all of those were tackled in there. But why don't you tell us about what you regard as the highlights of the budget proposed?
Sure. I was very happy to see the money that was put into public education. We have the Senate has increased that amount, and I think it's at one of the highest rates ever. They've also fully funded the target contribution for all communities. So Arlington is a community that spends much more money in education than they're required, and the state is responsible for always providing at least 17.5% of that. And so now all of the towns, I think in this budget, who had a higher contribution now are at the target minimum rate. So that's a good thing. That's going to allow us to move forward now with the new Foundation Budget Commission recommendations and start to change the formula so it better reflects the true costs of education. Mm-hmm. So I was happy to see that.
Particularly important for Arlington, as
Particularly important for Arlington because it's more focus on things like the cost of healthcare and what it takes to actually educate a student who's an English language learner or who has a disability. And so I think we are definitely moving in the right direction. Mm-hmm. Transportation, I was glad to see that there's a lot more money that was put in for regional transportation. And while Arlington is part of the MBTA system, my district is actually affected by regional transportation because, when you get up to Burlington and Billerica, they depend on a lot of transportation between communities that are outside of that district and which are covered by RTAs. So I thought that was a good piece. The earned income tax credit was raised for working families, which makes a huge difference for working families, for people being able to afford the necessities of daily living. And then I was especially glad to see that the Senate supported the increase in the mental health line item. And I think it's the most we've seen in several years. Having said that, it really just puts us back to where we were before we had 10 years of cuts. I'm very, very interested to see how that money's going to be spent and if we're really putting our money where our mouth is, to provide better services for mental health and substance use disorder. So I think those are some of the highlights. I have some local earmarks that I've put in that I'm looking forward to having passed. Every year we fund AYCC, and we've actually have a little more money than we usually have in that earmark.
And that's the
Arlington Youth Counseling Center.
Thank you.
And I've requested some money for the METCO late bus in Arlington and Lexington so that METCO students have an opportunity to stay after school and engage in activities and sports and be part of the community.
Such an important component.
Such an important. Yeah. There's a very successful early reading program in Woburn that I have that I've put in some money for, and there's some for Billerica and some for Burlington.
Right, we don't
but you don't really care
those.
Probably,
right.
But I do, and so So I'm looking forward to having those things in. But for Arlington, we fought very hard to support AYCC, and
which does wonderful work.
Does a wonderful and necessary work. Yeah,
absolutely. One of the things that I was struck by when I was looking over the numbers and doing a little bit of reading before the interview is that, as you've already alluded to, there were a number of increases in the Senate budget relative to either the governor's or the House in a number of areas, as you've already mentioned. That all coming without an increase on the revenue side, without any kind of broad-based tax increases. So where will that extra money come from?
Well, I think if you look at the three budgets, it's where each body chooses to put the money. And so
I see.
That's what the conference committee does, is it sits down and says, well, you wanted it here, we want it here, how do we reconcile this?
So, I'm sorry, so just for clarification purposes then for myself, what you're saying then is that all of the budgets add up to more or less the same amount of money.
Yes.
And it's just a question of how that is apportioned. And what we're saying is the Senate budget is clearly prioritizing some areas and obviously would just not be funding certain other things to the same degree. Yeah.
I think there's also some question because our receipts have come in much higher recently than were expected. And so I think some of that is being, my sense is that some of that is being calculated into the spending.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
And this is something that we have asked you about at other times as well, but I think people are always curious about is we are edging closer, it seems, to marijuana, not just the legalization, but the beginning of revenue being generated, I would think, through the marijuana industry, either medical marijuana or soon to be recreational marijuana. So does the budget account, or does the budget assume that there is going to be a certain amount of revenue coming from that, or is that not yet being baked in, so to speak?
I think it's not officially being baked in.
Okay. So for now, there might be some estimates in there, but my sense is, and I could be wrong, that it's not, we didn't do that with gaming, so I think we were treating, now we set up certain funds, we planned for certain activities because we expected to get gaming revenue, for instance, or gaming licensing, and I would imagine that the same thing is happening with medical marijuana. Okay, so it's with marijuana. Right. So that makes sense. Yeah. Let me ask you about another, part of every state budget and a specific concern for Arlington, and that is Chapter 70 money and state aid generally. We have noticed in doing some research that some of the surrounding communities around Arlington, specifically Belmont and Cambridge, have both seen double-digit increases in the state aid, and Arlington is lagging in that area. It's not state aid; it's Chapter 70. Okay, sorry. Okay. So Chapter 70 money local aid is pretty unrestricted. Local aid is pretty everybody's uniform. I think about 3.something%. Yeah. Got it. So excuse that. Right. And so to make the distinction, let's focus instead on Chapter 70 education funds, right? Right. So I think that is also the case, though, that there has been an increase in surrounding communities at a greater rate than in Arlington. So I don't know about the surrounding, I can't speak directly to it, but there's two factors, usually the number of students, and that's based on the last year's numbers. And then the other piece of it is target aid, so target minimum aid. So it could be that places like Belmont were farther from their target minimum aid than Arlington was. So when we raised everybody up to ensure that they got the minimum, I think it's 17.5%, that may be why you're seeing Belmont be higher or Cambridge be higher, because we were closer to that 87.5 or I can't remember, but or right. 83.5. That could very well be why you're seeing those increases, because that's what the Senate did, was ensure that everybody was at that target minimum. Yeah, that makes sense. And also I think something that you just said as part of the answer also is worth pointing out, and that is that as Arlington has seen year by year increases in student enrollment, and it's been a while now that has been the case, continuing to be the case, clearly there's going to be some disparity because, as you said, the aid is based on the previous year's numbers.
Right.
And again, we like to say that it's a good problem to have here in Arlington, this continuing increase in school enrollment. Nonetheless, good problems are still problems.
Right. Yeah. When you're setting it in October, it's different than when you're. There's another piece to it. Oh, I think also that the Senate, I believe, has increased that per pupil spending by about $30. So that's another, that will cause more money to come in, but it also, you may see a bigger gap.
And so tell us about what the next steps are procedurally. We have 3 different budgets having been presented, right? The governor's budget, the House budget, and the Senate budget. Now comes a period of reconciling those budgets?
So first the Senate has to pass their budget, and we'll be doing that next week. We'll be debating it. There are 1,200 amendments, which Senate Ways and Means will go through. And
is that an unusually large number?
It's pretty par for the course. I think it's 1,196. But there are often many amendments to the budget because it's people's opportunity to get their priorities in and get more money for the things that they really care about. So we will do that, and that will be finished right before Memorial Day. Then the House and the Senate will set up a conference committee. Each one will appoint 3 members, and then they will reconcile the differences between the House budget and the Senate budget. And then, and that has to be done by July 1st. And then and after the reconciliation is done, each body votes on the final version, and then that goes to the governor, and then the governor can line item veto particular pieces.
Okay, so does that mean that the governor's budget that his office released a little ways back is actually more a declaration of priorities than it is anything that...
Yes, it's a bit of a, I think the legislature looks and says, thank you for sharing.
Right, and then you actually get down, do the work.
Then you get down and do the work.
Point...
And some of the things you are in total agreement with, and, and some of them, they're not the priorities of the particular body, and so you don't see that. And so, but the reconciliation gets done between the House and the Senate. Right,
and you mentioned it's 3 members from each of those bodies
members, yeah,
that get together.
2 from the majority party and 1 from the minority party.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Anything else that I was thinking about moving on to a next topic, but I want to make sure that if there's anything else that we haven't talked about the budget that you'd like to mention, that we have an opportunity.
There probably is, but I can't think of it right now.
Maybe it'll come up later in the conversation. Something that got people's attention just last week is a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court.
On sports betting.
To permit sports betting along. Well, I don't know how. I haven't looked at it closely enough to know what boundaries or limits there are. It does seem to have expanded whatever limits there were. What are the implications for Massachusetts as you see them, and what do you think? Well,
I was not in favor of Massachusetts having legalizing gambling. Didn't think it was a good idea and don't think it's a good idea. Having said that, we have legalized gambling, and gambling is gambling. And I think so if we're going to allow people to go to a casino, we need to allow people to do sports betting.
You don't see a distinction.
I don't see a distinction, except that we'll sort of be subsidizing one industry and ignoring another, and I didn't sign up to support the Wynn Casino. Mm-hmm. So we have it. The Secretary of State, the Attorney General was it last year, a year and a half ago, whatever, came out with a set of regulations for sports betting, for sports companies, right? DraftKings is a big Massachusetts company, a growing Massachusetts company. They're one of the leaders in the sports betting area. So I think what will happen is that the Supreme Court had its ruling that said you must allow it, or you can't
right. Good
ban
news
it.
for DraftKings, et cetera.
Good news for DraftKings. But it doesn't mean that the states can't regulate it. And so the Attorney General has come up with a set of regulations. She did, and I think she did it because she knew that it was probably that the ban would be struck down by the Supreme Court. So we have requirements in place, like, age and who can what you have to show that you have the means to gamble, or I mean, there's a whole number of regulations, and honestly, I don't remember them all. She came out, it was big news about a year and a half ago. So we have things in place. So I think it's basically given that this ruling's come down, that it will be good for Massachusetts. Everybody does sports betting. Let's not pretend. And if we can get some revenue on something that everybody's doing, desperate revenue that we desperately need, then I think in the end, Massachusetts the state at least, and revenue will benefit from it.
Right. So overall, obviously not something that you're in favor of, as
Right.
you just said, but given the fact that it is a fact, good for us in a sense that Attorney General Maura Healey was out in front of it, so that therefore we can just implement the regulations that were formulated at that time, and as you say, potential source of revenue. I would think significant.
I would think so
quite
too.
significant
It's evidently quite a big industry, and we'll have to watch it and tweak it. And our job is to make sure that the protections and the policies in place that allow it to be as successful but as controlled as it can be.
Okay, well, switching topics, I wanted to ask you about your work on the committee and committees that you are involved in, and particularly just let us know what is going on in those committees that is of significance as far as you're concerned.
Sure. So one of the pieces that I actually ended up working on was the Group Insurance Commission changes that came about unbeknownst to everybody. And that was in the Public Service. Well, actually, that wasn't in the Public Service Committee. It just came out from the GIC. So I've done some work with colleagues on tightening up that process so that we're not blindsided the way we were last time.
I remember we talked about this last time you were here,
And I know there's a lot of people that don't know what the Group Insurance Commission is. They don't realize that it's the health insurance for state employees and for many municipal employees, like in Arlington.
Yes,
but it affects. There's 500,000 people that it affects, so it's a big deal.
And we've talked about it often. We've referred to it often as part of this series, and also Your Arlington Dollar, which looks at money coming in and out in Arlington, because the GIC, the adoption of the GIC for Arlington has made such a difference to how long we've been able to extend the override that we had a number of years ago. So very significant. People may or may not know what GIC is or how it's composed or how it does its work, et cetera. But the impact is very broad.
Yes, it's deep. So we have we put some language in the budget that is going to focus on process and also who's on the committee, who's on the commission. It really struck us as extremely odd that, with the exception of one position that the governor hasn't filled, nobody is required to have any experience in health insurance. And we thought, So we've done some work around that. I also have a bill that I wrote that has to do with violent crimes against a police officer, that for a police officer that has been involved in an attack on them and during the course of their duties, and it has either been totally debilitating, a permanent serious injury, that they get a much larger benefit. Right now they get the standard. You go out on a permanent disability, you get 72%. When you're 65, you get whatever your pension would be. And so we have a bill that says no, if you are seriously injured and permanently injured in a violent act in the line of duty, then you need to get 100% and some other benefits. So we're pushing that in the budget, and I'm going to look forward to trying to get that passed. And then the other piece is the work we're doing in the mental health and substance use recovery. So the Senate is working on their version of the opioid bill that the governor filed, and we're looking at really significantly expanding access to treatment. And we really are focusing on the whole issue of parity between behavioral health and parity between physical health. And let me be clear, there is not parity. It's the law of the land, and it doesn't exist. So we're really
there's a
focused
disparity, you're saying, between the way that we treat physical health
and the way we treat behavioral health. And it's becoming a major crisis. It is a major crisis. People are not getting care. We still continue to see people who are ill being treated in our jails and courts. And it's getting harder for people to access treatment. And this is especially alarming because so much of behavioral health, mental health, and substance use disorder starts at a young age. And all of the research and all of the evidence-based practice shows us that helping people when they're younger with that first episode of mental illness or early use of substances really makes a difference. And yet, I think of all the places where it's difficult to access treatment, it's with youth. And we've just got to we have to get people to feel the sense of urgency of what's going on, and it's profound. Providers no longer want to provide services because they can't make ends meet. After they spend all the time doing the insurance writing and submitting claims and filling out forms and doing work that they don't get paid for, like calling the school or talking to a doctor, they end up making less than $15 an hour. And you can't ask people to do the work and not get paid. And we really treat our providers, our behavioral health providers, badly.
Yeah, and I know that I remember hearing a report on the radio not very long ago about there being a kind of low-level mutiny, in a sense, among such care providers, because again, it's just as what you were saying, they simply cannot make ends meet when they're doing socially vital, right, exactly, absolutely essential work. Obviously, this is not the only area in which we can point out that kind of discrepancy, but it is one that deserves to have some light shone shown on it.
And health insurance is our biggest budget buster. It is growing out of control. And we need to do everything we can to shift our dollars to treatment that works, to treatment that actually services the whole person. And every country every developed country in the world has a system where they spend much more time on primary care and preventive care. And our dollars go into specialists and lots of tests, and we provide very little money for that. I think 5% of our healthcare dollars are done at the primary care level, as opposed to 85% in other countries. So we really need to shift our paradigm of how we provide healthcare.
Yeah, and I know that the same thing that you're talking about there has reflected throughout the omnibus criminal justice reform bill that was happily passed in this session as well. So clearly there is an awareness, but also action now being taken at the State House that hopefully will be changing the landscape.
Yes, that would be great.
Over the next while. I can't help but think in the answer you were just giving, you pointed out how there is insufficient attention paid to intervening or providing services and support early, and that we are in a sense exposing and making our youth more vulnerable at a time where if we were better able to protect them or help them at that time, the benefits would be clear and long lasting. That reminds me of the situation in general around how we treat our youth. And by youth, I am in this case referring more to people on the cusp of legal age. So, from 16,
emerging adults.
Right, exactly. So what we think of as young adults, late teens, whatever you want to say, let's say just 16 to 22, 24, something like that. There is a certain kind of cognitive dissonance in the way, as a society, we treat people in that situation, because in some ways we want to respect the fact that they're still emerging from childhood, but then in other ways, we don't trust them to make decisions about alcohol and other substances, but we'll put guns in their hands and we'll put them in the Army. And so just talk a little bit. I know that you've got strong and well-articulated views about these issues, and how can we tackle this discrepancy? What do you see as the places where we really need to take action?
Well, I don't know how articulate my responses are, but I think we are seeing it's a real conundrum. And when I step away from it, what I see is that this is really a cultural shift, that we're asking people, and lawmakers are people, to make a cultural shift from what we used to believe and the way the world used to work to what's happening now. So in addition to it being a much more complicated world, and in some ways more dangerous because of the access that everybody has to things that will harm them, from guns to weapons of mass destruction to cyber attacks to substance use. We're also learning that the stages of development are not as clear cut as we thought they were. And we're really asking people to relook at how we treat people of a certain age. And that just takes a long time. I've been involved in many conversations and some debates around, we wanted to change the age from 18 to 19 in the criminal justice bill for what was determined in a youth. And people really said, hey, when you're 18 years old, you can sign a contract, you can go to war, you got to be responsible for yourself. They don't quite see the fact that, okay, and when you're 18, we're giving you a gun, we're letting you sign a contract, you can drive a car whenever you want, you can vote, but we're not going to let you drink and we're not going to let you smoke. And I don't think we should let anybody smoke, okay? I think I think people can drink if they drink very moderately. It's not going to hurt you. But I have an incredibly hard time saying to somebody, we're going to let you put a gun in your hand. Now, we're going to train you, and that's important, okay? But we're going to put you out on the front line and have an experience that hopefully none of us ever have to experience. But we're going to tell you what you can do with your life, with your body, with your, And I support the increase in tobacco buying, but I don't do it because I feel comfortable about it. I do it because my constituents really, really want to limit the access of cigarettes.
So you mean the increase in the age? The
increase in age of buying cigarettes. I have to be really honest to everybody. I have a really hard time with that because, And the response that I get from the advocates is, well, no one should be carrying a gun, or no 18-year-old. And I agree, but I can't do anything about that.
That's right. That's right.
And we do need people to protect us, and so that it gets really complicated for me. It's really interesting. A group of senators, and I think the head of the trial courts, and a number of other people went over to Germany to look at their programs for emerging adults in jails, prisons, and the criminal justice system. And they have a completely different way of looking at how you treat young offenders. They have minimal use of heroin in the society. Their recidivism rates are astronomically low, and they treat emerging adults or youth offenders through diversion. And so we're really trying to move that into that, in that direction. But it's a cultural shift, and it takes people a while to make that cultural shift, to look at things differently. And the dissonance comes with we're talking out of both sides of our mouth.
Right, exactly.
And we do the same thing with substance use treatment. All the evidence shows us that medicated assisted treatment, where you give people methadone, Suboxone, Vivitrol, when you use that as the major part of therapy along with support, it works. If you put people in a room for a month and you don't give them anything for their, to support them through medication, the recidivism rates are astronomically high. And yet, getting people, people say to me, I don't feel comfortable treating a drug problem with drugs. Well, we don't say that about chemical reactions in our body when it's diabetes or when it's high blood pressure. That's all chemicals, right? We're fine with that. But we have these leftover notions of the way the world's supposed to work, and it takes a while to incorporate those new learnings.
Yeah, and as you say, that goes right back to what you have already been talking about, which is that discrepancy, very stark, between the way that we treat physical health and the way that we treat mental or behavioral health.
Right.
And again, like you said, parity between those as a society and as our government institutions. If we can achieve that, we'll have gone a long way. Speaking of which, just thinking about hopeful signs, to the extent that there are any or many, certainly it does seem like a hopeful development, what is going on in Middlesex Sheriff's Department with the introduction of a youth or a young person's unit, where you can begin to implement the kinds of approaches that you've just described. And I know that Sheriff Katujian and the Middlesex Sheriff's Department in general and the Department of Corrections, they are committed to both, not just recognizing that those facts, as you've already mentioned, but to implementing programs which will address these things as mental health issues, as behavioral modification that we're looking for, and not, from that very traditional place of somebody's done something wrong and let's punish him or her.
Even though we keep doing it, it doesn't work.
Right.
We are very, very, very lucky to have Sheriff Katujian as our sheriff. He's really been a leader and an innovator in criminal justice, and he is somebody who really looks for the evidence-informed best practices, and he's not afraid to try out something that has that evidence, is evidence-informed, and we're just so lucky to have him. And I feel like he and I have become real partners in this whole area. We're working on a restoration center together, which would be a place where the police could bring people who are in the middle of a mental health episode or having substance use episode, where we could bring them and they would immediately get care. They'd get triaged. There would be beds there if they needed them. There would be social worker, nurses, doctors, but they would start to get care that they needed immediately instead of being put in a jail cell or sitting in an emergency room for 4 days. So we're working on that together, and we've started meetings, and we're both really excited about it.
Yeah,
and our police chief is amazing.
I was going to say, we could never, he's gotten plenty of props from ACMi and ACMi Public Affairs Programming, but deservedly so. Again, what you're describing in your own approach and Sheriff Katujan's approach is also reflected in Arlington by Chief Ryan and the Arlington Police Department's approach to all of this stuff. And as you said, the data is there. This works.
Yes, it works.
You put it that way succinctly earlier about another thing, but if we can just, focus on what works.
Right.
And not on value judgments around it, et cetera, and implement what works. It seems so simple, doesn't it?
It does, but boy, people bring all their stuff to the conversation, and so it's difficult. But we're very, very lucky, and one of the things that I think about as a legislator is you shouldn't have to live in Arlington or have, with a police chief like Fred Ryan, or be lucky to live in Middlesex with a sheriff like Katujan to get the help. And
right, it shouldn't be arbitrary. It shouldn't just be a matter of
we feel
good fortune or
lucky,
not.
But it's
right. It should be the baseline, shouldn't it?
It should be the baseline. So that's what we strive for when we, or at least what I strive for when I am looking at legislation.
Yeah, it really is. For all of the frustrations and the intense demands of the job that you do, you are in a position to make that from being the exception to being the rule, at least doing what you can to do so. And you guys have more leverage in that way than other bodies.
Yep, it's the goal. We don't often get there, but we won't stop trying.
Right, absolutely, and that's what we count on, and we know we can. I did want to ask you, without putting you on the spot, I just wanted to ask you if there was anything that you wanted to share with us that we haven't covered today. I always want to make that invitation without making it a demand for you to come up with something.
I just want people to know that I have an unbelievably phenomenal staff, and that we are available to help constituents, that we love to help constituents, that it makes us all feel good because we actually are doing something for somebody. And so people should really feel free to get in touch with me or get in touch with our office, 617-722-1432, if there's any way they think that we can help them.
Great, and we will be sure to include that information, of course. I said it at the beginning, I really do mean it. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Really appreciate your taking the time. I know you've got to run off.
Yes.
So we will let you go and deal with the business of the day, but thanks so much for joining us.
And thank you so much. It's really fun to talk with you.
And we will be back in some month's time to get a further update from our state senator, Cindy Friedman. For now, we are done. My name is James Milan. We appreciate your being here, and we'll see you next time.